Welcome to Disagree to Agree, a channel where high schoolers have a conversation about pressing issues in society. Today's discourse will be about the use of the SAT and the ACT in the US college application process. As many of you may know, many colleges have gone test optional or test blind amidst the coronavirus pandemic. Some programs, such as the UC system, have even declared this a permanent change. Today, we have Adam El Bahey advocating for the continuation of tests such as the SAT and the ACT in the college review process. Adam, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, so I'm Adam, as said by Sam, and I do public forum debate in high school. And yeah, I'm just ready to debate based on my beliefs of the SAT being necessary in college.
Thank you. Now, opposing the continuation of SAT and ACTs, we have Jai Bhatia. Can you please introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, so I'm a sophomore in high school. I do public forum debate, and yeah, I'm ready to debate against the SAT and ACT. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. My name is Samuel, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'll present a nuance of the topic, and then I'll allow the panelists ample time to respond to each other. Both panelists are encouraged to interact constructively with opposing ideas. Remember, there are no winners or losers in this discussion. The goal is for everyone to learn something new. I will balance the speaking time evenly between both speakers. Let's begin. My first question is to provide some context. What is the SAT or ACT, and what is its history in the American education system? Adam, can you begin?
Okay, so these are tests administered to high school students in America in order for them to be assessed by colleges. So they're standardized tests that are given in administrations to a large amount of students from different schools on different months. And these tests are the SAT is based on English and mathematics with multiple sections, and the ACT is English, mathematics, and science. So these are objective tests that are mostly graded by the computer, except for the essay section. And the SAT is graded on a scale from 200 to 1600, and the ACT up to 36.
Jay, do you have anything to add on the SAT's history or more uses in modern education?
Yeah. So okay, I agree with like the definition that it's like a test and like the math section, all of that. But I just want to add on. So I agree that the SAT and ACT are standardized tests for students to take a score, but the original SAT was actually adapted from an intelligence test used to screen recruits for the US Army during the First World War. So basically, now there's a company named the College Board that's like administering the SAT, and the College Board is supposedly a nonprofit, but like there are so many facts that calls this into question. Because the SAT and the ACT cost around $55 to $70 per test, depending on like what areas you want to test yourself on. And the College Board generates $750 million in revenue like every year, and it sells the test prep materials. It sells like other like books and all of that, creating like a cycle of revenue for itself. So I'd say that the College Board is actually very profit driven, which is not good. But so that's why now colleges are actually eliminating the SAT, as Sam said before, because there are a lot of studies indicating that it's not even a great predictor of success for college graduation rates.
I may interject here. I mean,
Yeah.
The reason the SAT is being not administered now is because of the coronavirus and the closing down of testing locations and such.
Okay.
Other than that, there has been a gradual shift towards test optional policies, but this is mostly towards solving for student stress and students having not enough time to study for the tests.
Okay.
And just the adaptation of the tests in general. I mean, the UC system, for example, is still going to give a standardized test once they get rid of the SAT.
So Adam, just following up on what Jay said, do you find the privatization of the standardized testing industry or like this education industry in general to be a problem?
No, so the thing is, I find that, yes, the College Board may be slightly corrupt at the top, but they're not generating a profit. In their essence, they're still a nonprofit, and they're still providing a service that gives opportunities to millions of students nationwide every single year. Like, for example, administering the PSAT, the SAT, giving free waivers to take those tests, giving subject tests. They do so much, and yes, they generate revenue from it, but they're still a nonprofit in their essence, and that money has to go somewhere. Some of it does go into the leaders' pockets, but other parts of that money have to go into helping disadvantaged students, setting up their partnership with Khan Academy, and I don't think it's as corrupt as Jay makes it seem, and I don't think it's an issue that it's privatized.
Okay, so I want to add on to that. I actually disagree. I agree with the fact that it provides like testing to everyone, but the test itself actually costs like $55 to $70 per person per test. So I don't really find that equitable. Also, just the concept of having a private company administer tests for the entire country, that's just not okay, because like giving this one company that much power to administer a test that students take to determine their future, like that just like doesn't sit right with me, because like they can like do whatever they want to this test, and that will basically determine the outcomes of like all the high schoolers' futures, which is like not okay. What I think should happen is we should have like a federally funded test. Like the federal government should administer a test with like zero bias, zero profit incentive, like actually looking at the objective of like giving
Wait,
people
so just 1 second. For clarification, Jay, you're pro standardized testing if it's not privatized?
I'd say the concept of standardized testing, like I'm not arguing about the concept, I'm arguing about the implementation, like specifically the SAT and the ACT.
Just
Okay,
that is bad.
like,
and also on the Sam, so on the $50 to $75 that you keep talking about, I mean,
yeah,
there's free waivers given out to like hundreds of thousands of students every year, right, who are below a certain income threshold, and all they have to do is say they are below that income threshold, and they get to take the SAT for free, right? So this non-equitability doesn't come from the cost of the test, right? Where does it come from?
Okay, so actually the cost of the test is just one part. I'd say the real inequity comes from preparing for the test. So what happens is that wealthy families, they pay for their child or children to go to these really expensive like prep colleges, centers. And basically what they do is they pay like thousands of dollars for like a summer course or for like a fall winter course, where the students just like get like private tutored just to follow like the test exactly and prepare for like what's going to be on the test.
On that point, while that practice in itself may be problematic in some way, but what's the effect of this prep on students? Because like there's research showing that this prep only generates 5 to 20 points in a greater SAT score, and the great thing about the SAT is that 5 to 20 points doesn't really show that much, right?
Yeah. Okay, so actually so basically the College Board actually posts their like stats, they post their studies on their website, and on their own website there's a graph, and it's like really neat because it literally shows family income compared to score, and you can see that there's a direct correlation
on that point. The SAT scores are correlated with so many things that are correlated in and of themselves with each other, right? We can't say that the SAT is caused by this in the process. For example, the SAT is correlated with parental education, it's correlated with race, it's correlated with socioeconomic status. Your scores are correlated with so many things that are in and of themselves correlated with each other, and on top of that, there's so many other factors in admission that are also correlated with these things that just not having the SAT doesn't solve. Like, for example, the test prep factor. People take prep for their college essays and go to courses. It's the same thing. So if you're advocating for that having to stop, then you have to advocate for no more essays, right? Yeah. And people without internet can't submit applications. That's 6% of the American population. See, there's issues that you just wouldn't solve for by taking out the SAT, and you wouldn't really help in any way.
Yeah,
right?
Okay, so we should like go back to the, like, I feel like we're going to touch on this more later.
Yeah, so we'll get into resource disparities later, but like one last question about the administration of the test. So Jay talked about both the privatization and the monopolization of this like standardized testing industry. So Adam, do you find specifically the monopolization of like the SATs and ACTs a big problem?
Okay, the SATs and ACTs are administered by two different organizations, and I don't find the monopolization of a problem because it creates uniformity in the college admissions process. From middle school or from elementary school, everybody knows at this point, these are the tests I have to take, the SAT and the ACT, and whatever subject tests or AP tests, right? once we take out that uniformity, then students have to study for so many different tests that are known for so many different things. For example, a UC test, I don't know, might be harder on math. So then they have to put so much extra time into math. And then the Stanford test would be harder on something else. So creating this uniformity relieves stress from students' lives and also makes it easier for them to study and makes them more prepared for the test. So when it comes to everybody knowing what's on the test, being objective and transparent, then having a monopoly is the best thing for standardized testing.
Okay, so I just want to add to that. So what Adam said about like only having one test and only having to prepare for that one test, you have to look at the mindset of the test takers themselves. Sure, there may be like one or two tests that are like standardized and everyone knows they're going to take, but like there's so many issues that happens with this because the scope of what is applied, like the scope applied to what is taught to these K through 12 classrooms becomes way too narrow because there's so much time prepping for the test itself and learning test taking skills instead of actually broadening in like an actual knowledge base. And what I'm saying is that the SAT is just a knowledge test. It's not an actual test of like your intuitive skills. Right?
Can you give me an example of narrowing student learning in elementary or middle school in order to help them prepare for the SAT?
Okay, so
actually, this is what we're about to talk about. So I'll introduce the next section and you guys can like just continue right where you ended. So like our next section will be about whether students of different backgrounds have equal opportunity to prepare for, Our next section will be about the intended function of standardized testing. Are SAT and ACT scores representative of academic abilities? What skills do the SAT or ACT really measure? And what is the correlation with future success in college and in one's career? So Jay, you can just continue.
Okay, just to answer your question that you were asking before, Adam, I have a study conducted by All Wayne. I can send you it. It tests the effectiveness of like the fairness of standardized tests. And it found that other than simply causing severe anxiety, such tests have narrowed educational programs to focus solely on what the test will cover instead of cultivating a well-rounded curriculum that will like allow students to actually learn and remember what they were taught. So basically, when it's created to be exactly equal among students, this equality requires the assumption that every student received equal education. So like if standardized tests are— So
you're saying equal education is a bad thing?
No, I'm saying the concept of an equal standardized test relies on the assumption that everyone gets equal education. So you have to like take into account that
well, everybody gets the same baseline education, right? That's the whole goal of the public system. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that there's so many disparities that you can't really
if everybody gets the same baseline education from the public schooling system, and that's the baseline that's needed on the SAT. For example, it doesn't matter if you took pre-calculus honors in sophomore year or calculus on the SAT, because the test only goes up to what is the standard based on the nation that you're in, right? It goes up to algebra 1 or algebra 2. So the baseline education that you get in public school is what's being tested, right?
Yeah, but I'd say that like aside from what's just being asked by the questions on the test, there are so many differences. So I can bring up cultural differences because traditionally test constructors have been white and middle class. And this is a big source of bias because there's so many cultural differences between test authors and lower socioeconomic status users in the style of thinking, perceiving and reasoning, and in values and expectations. And like a standardized test penalizes the child with a small hearing vocabulary and provides a cultural bias.
So the bias that you're talking about was previously, back in the day, mostly seen in the analogy section, right? And that section isn't even on the standardized test anymore, right?
Okay, so actually the bias, that's one of the biases I'm talking about, but the bigger one is a cultural bias shown through language barriers. So the SAT and ACT are the most widely accepted standardized tests, but they have a language barrier. Like there's no English, there's no like at this time, like neither the ACT or the SAT are offered in foreign languages.
Wait, but on that point, there is other standardized tests that international students take to show that they are proficient in other languages.
Yeah,
and there are so many other tests that they can take, right?
Yeah, so I agree that the scope of this debate right now is the SAT and the ACT. And as I said before,
the SAT and the ACT aren't like, they don't have to solve for international students, right? They have other tests like the TOEFL.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that like they're the most widely accepted standardized tests. So if you're going to a college that requires the SAT or ACT and you don't speak English, you're automatically at a disadvantage. like if you're like going to this college and they're like, oh, we only take
Okay,
this
first, classes are taught in English at that college if it only accepts English. I mean, that not knowing English isn't just a barrier on admissions, it's a barrier in your classes at that point. I mean,
Yeah, but the SAT and ACT
What?
aren't supposed to test your English. Like on the math section, if it's asking you a question in English and you can't read the question in English or you like misconstrue it, that's not testing your math skills correctly. That's testing your English skills. So I'd say that like it's not a fair evaluation.
okay, but like I'm saying, if you don't know English, then there's no way you can succeed in an American college which teaches said classes, said lectures in complex English in an at a high academic level, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so on to Sam's question, can you just restate it because we went off on a little tangent there?
So I'll have Jay start. Like earlier, you touched on this a bit. You said that the SAT and ACT really don't measure academic abilities or your intellect. They really just measure your ability to take a test. Like they make you like study for test taking skills. So can you elaborate on that a bit? And then Adam, you can respond.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's also like okay, I feel like it's not a good like you can't just like quantify the knowledge of a student. That's like not like the concepts may be like there, but what I'm saying is that the implementation is totally wrong. The SAT and the ACT are not implemented in a way that it's equitable to society. Like, and you can look at like there's so many other alternatives that we can look to for standardized testing, and there's so many other ways to weigh this into a college admissions like application that I just don't think it's worth it. And also GPA is already a good like even if you don't want to like go into these like crazy alternative ideas, you can just look to GPA. Like the University of California, Berkeley literally told us that like the strongest predictor of college success is actually high school grades in college prep courses. So there's really no need for a standardized test.
Okay, at the point where we're going to debate about biases and who gets helped by what, then at that point, GPA cannot be an argument for the removal of the SAT. GPA is so much more inflated in rich, white, upper middle class schools and private schools that people in those schools are far more likely to have inflated GPAs, while those in low socioeconomic schools are more likely to have lower grades, and at that point, their GPAs are deflated, right? So once that happens, then it's not fair for lower income students who would do about the same on an SAT as their upper middle class white peers to only get it accepted to a school based on grades which aren't representative of what they know or what they've learned, right?
Yeah. So can I just follow up with that? So
Yeah.
I have a study of almost 125,000 students entering the UC system, and they found that the strongest predictor of college success was actually the GPA, because grades also had the least adverse effect on admission of low-income and minority applicants. So high school grades are sometimes viewed as like a less reliable indicator because schools differ in like grading practices, which is what you're saying. But SAT scores are actually based on a single sitting of 3 to 4 hours, whereas high school GPA is based on the repeated sampling of how a student performs over like several years.
First, there's a logical issue with your study. Your study talks about college students that have been accepted into college. As I've said, if we're taking into account GPA as colleges right now are, and not looking at the SAT as much as they used to, then we're looking at students who are getting in because they went to private school, because they had GPA inflation, because they were able to take some class such as because they were able to take honors classes in freshman year and sophomore year, AP classes in those years. And at that point, then those classes aren't available to every student in America. It's not a fair system. However, in terms of the SAT and the ACT, the baseline education is there for every single student in America to be able to take the test and score based on what they have learned. And even it's not a single sitting. There's studying that every American can do as long as they have internet. Internet's a different issue, which I can touch upon later, but in terms of Khan Academy, okay, this is such an important resource. The corrupt apparently for profit that is the College Board in your eyes collaborated with Khan Academy to get free full length practice tests available for all students who have access to an internet connection for free. They got prep courses. They got predicted scores. At that point, then you have a whole curriculum that if you want, you can take online for free. Therefore, there's less bias in the SAT based on socioeconomic background than if we shifted to solely GPA.
Okay, so we're going to talk about socioeconomic background next, but first, like, there has been a lot of talk about the effectiveness of GPA in measuring future success. Can both of you give like a very short statement about the effectiveness of standardized testing in measuring future success, or like measuring your academic abilities? Jay, you can go first, and then Adam.
Yeah. So touching back to the study, I think Adam missed this point. I'm just going to restate it. So the strongest predictor of college success was high school grades in college prep courses. And grades had the least adverse effect on admissions of low income and minority applicants. So basically, when you say that low income students are actually being like, it's worse for them, it's actually like the least
Yeah,
adverse effects
Jay, that's
were
not
mentioned.
something I missed. That was kind of my point. So the GPA right now isn't harming students because we're also using standardized testing. But once we take out that standardized testing, then they can only go off of grades. And empirically, it's been shown that white upper middle class students have inflated GPAs and higher
Yeah.
grades
So
because of
you
the
can,
opportunities present to them.
yeah.
So once we
So
take out the standardized testing, then that adverse effect becomes a small adverse effect becomes a giant effect on admissions, right? Because at that point, the only way you can make it up is through essays and letters of recommendation.
okay.
And
So
you don't have the
basically,
standardized testing that's a baseline that's uniform for every single student in the country.
yeah. So basically, the grades are actually like in the study, they were only looking at grades, and they found that that was the least adverse effect. But
Yeah.
if you don't want to take my word for that, I can give you the example of Hampshire College that actually eliminated standardized test scores, and in return, they received like very good results.
Isn't Hampshire College closed for losing all their money and being a small liberal arts school? I mean,
Okay, well, that's like unrelated to the point, right? What I
yeah,
want
it
to say,
is. They weren't able to succeed as a college because, first of all, they were based off of alumni donors. Now they have no alumni because their students aren't doing well because there's no standardized tests.
okay,
Right?
I feel like
Their college had to
very
close
strong
down.
correlation.
Okay.
Like, okay, wait, can I just say like what they found? They found that like the percentage of students who accepted the invitation rose, the quantity of applications went down, but the quality went up because it was harder to apply.
I
And
think my point here is, first, Hampshire College is a tiny liberal arts school, now closed, had student classes of about 100 people, isn't representative of anything because most of the students are liberal arts students, which in general are white students who are also middle class. At that point, then it's not a good representation of anything that would happen in the college admission process once we remove the SAT, because we're talking about low-income students who are not white.
Okay, so both of you have already been talking a lot about socioeconomic background and racial background, so we'll just formally move on to this section. So the next section will be about whether students of different backgrounds have equal opportunity to prepare for the test. How much influence does socioeconomic class have on student performance on the SAT or ACT? Is there a disparity in test preparation resources across different racial groups or socioeconomic classes? Adam, you already talked a bit about this, so you can go first.
Okay, so I cited a study by Kunsel 2018 from the Wall Street Journal and Johns Hopkins University that tells you that researchers have concluded that gains due to test prep are 5 to 20 points. At that point, then the private courses that Jay says are giving richer students a huge advantage in tests that would be wiped out if we take away the SAT simply doesn't exist. He says that if Kunsel tells you that if a private test area or a private test prep advertises itself as 100 to 200 points SAT gain, it usually gives about a 5 to 20 point gain, and more of that gain on the math test as about 14 points on math and 4 on verbal. So this tells you that these like private courses that Jay is talking about don't actually help the wealthy and privileged. They don't help anyone. They're a waste of money. And as long as College Board is there and is collaborating with Khan Academy, then this doesn't even matter because everybody has access to a test prep style course that has a set curriculum, is adaptive to the student, and is has full length practice tests. So that's an important part. Before, people had to pay to get full length practice tests. Now you have 10 free full-length practice tests, and you get auto-scored on each subsection, given a detailed background so that students know what to study on. Then Khan Academy is solving already for any sort of socioeconomic bias in terms of test prep, and I say that test scores are a correlation at this point and not caused by socioeconomic class.
okay, so I actually have like a kind of long response to this. So first, I'm gonna go over like the factors of upbringing, and then I want to go over what you said about like okay, and then I want to go over like the whole concept of the debate. So first, let's go on to factors of upbringing. So we see two differences. First, we see cultural differences because test constructors have been white and middle class, and this is a bias because there's a difference between them and lower socioeconomic status users in the style of thinking, perceiving, reasoning, and in values and expectations. But then again, it penalizes the child with a small hearing vocabulary and provides a social source of like cultural bias in these tests against children from many urban areas and from homes where a foreign language is spoken. So if you, and like one example of the cultural bias on the SAT and ACT is language barriers, because the SAT and ACT are one of the most widely accepted standardized tests and in college, in undergraduate and college university applications, and neither are offered in foreign languages. And additionally,
I've talked about this before. I mean,
yeah, but I still want to just go over it because like if a college is only offering the SAT or ACT, there's an automatic bias because you're forced to take
only
it
offering
outside of that
classes
college.
in English as well.
Okay, so now I'll go into socioeconomic status. Modern critics note that standardized test scores largely reflect the socioeconomic status privilege. That's partly because rich kids with mediocre scores can juice their results with expensive private test preparation courses. But so what Adam says is that there's only a 20-point difference, but I want you to look at like the statistics that College Board themselves like posted. Like there's a direct correlation between family
College Board
income
has
and
posted
average
about
SAT.
the correlation, which I already mentioned. I mean, I'm
Okay,
telling you
so-
that the causation has been shown to be about 20 points. And you're not solving for socioeconomic class anyways by taking out the SAT. As I've said before, there's still prep courses for essays. There's people like, you can get private essay checks. You're not solving for anything. You can get
So the prep courses-
amazing letters of recommendation written by like teachers who have been doing it for like multiple years. I mean, you're not solving for anything by taking out the SAT. And at that point, even it is only a 20-point increase and not 100 to 200 points. And also you're ignoring Khan Academy.
Okay, well, let me just like go over all of this. So basically, there is a direct correlation between like lower socioeconomic status people and higher socioeconomic status people and their scores. Like you can tell me that there's like no correlation without causation, but if people making more than $200,000 are getting a 500-point increase from people that are making only $40,000 in their family income, I'd say that the test isn't even a measure of like intuition.
I've already addressed this. I'm telling you the SAT is correlated with so many different things, and so is every other factor of college admissions. Parental education, race, socioeconomic class. These are things that you simply don't solve for by taking out the SAT.
Okay, so what I'm saying
is the SAT and taking out the SAT solves for nothing while hurting low-income students.
Yeah, okay. So I really want to talk about the concept of the test. There's like this whole concept that the test is supposed to be a test of like how smart you are, but it's only testing knowledge. It's not testing intelligence. We want our students to be able to use their application of thinking, and we don't want our students to just be memorizing a test format and just blindly answering things. So sure, your points can stand
to that
about
point.
That.
Explain to me how, for example, the reading section is about memorizing anything.
Okay, wait. I really want to just go over I had a whole thing written down.
This is just on your point. Explain to me how the reading test requires any sort of memorization and isn't a direct application of student critical thinking.
Okay, so basically, when you go into a college prep center, they're going to be like, okay, so this is going to be the essay. Okay, first of all, the essay isn't even required. But second of all, if you go
I'm talking about the reading portion, Jay.
Oh, the reading portion. Okay, so I actually know there are several YouTube videos I've watched, several prep academies that have told me that on the reading section, you just read the first two sentences, the last two sentences, and that'll tell you when it asks you a question about oh, what's the gist of this paragraph? You read the first two sentences, the last two sentences, and you got it. And then when it's
but the questions are all about but the questions on the reading section, if you look at them, are mostly about content and what can the author do in order. They're about the actual meat of the paragraph, and not about the gist of the essays. Yeah, that's something to just make yourself go faster, and that's something anybody can learn.
No, but this is a flaw because the tests are supposed to make you think intuitively.
I mean, that's exactly what the reading section does. That's what the grammar section does.
No, but what I'm telling you is that
calculator section does. I mean.
No, okay, what I'm telling you is that that's not happening because the grammar section, you're just memorizing grammar rules. For the reading section, you're just memorizing key words that tell you, oh, this person is antagonistic, and then you look for a bunch of keywords and you memorize the keywords and you answer the question. But Jay, I want to talk the concept of the test. It skews the mindset of the test takers because basically there's too much time spent prepping for this test itself and not broadening an actual intuitive knowledge base. If we want to raise a society cultivated of people that can actually apply their knowledge, this test is really
there will always be too much time and too much stress associated with college applications, and taking out the SAT doesn't help because at that point people are going to put more of their effort into doing other things to boost their application.
But that's exactly doing right?
Yeah. But I'm saying that's bad because the SAT is the best way for colleges to look at who's going to to narrow down applications, right? And at that point, we tell you that the SAT is the most objective way to do it because there's no bias associated, and that it does assess critical thinking in all of the sections except for you could contest maybe that on the last math section there are some questions that don't require critical thinking. But in every other section, you're required to think about the answers before you put them in. You have to solve problems. You have to critically analyze text, a skill needed in college. You have to think about grammar rules, which, yes, you have to memorize. And you know why you need to memorize grammar rules? Because you need them in future jobs. This is something that's needed in your career. And in the math section, it's all about problem solving and how to solve certain equations. It's not about memorization or tricks like competitive math. No, it's about how to problem solve. It's algebra 1 and algebra 2. It's all algebraic, and it's about how you solve these things. There's no memorization needed.
So I'd say like the whole concept of just testing knowledge base, I feel like honestly it's too, I'd say it's too knowledge based. Like even if you want to go like say that it's not knowledge based, that the SAT is needed, I already provided you the UC system. Like UC Berkeley literally told us that there's no difference between taking in the GPA and taking in a standardized test. So why
but I tell you that UC Berkeley first has multiple issues with it. First, affirmative action changes their application process. Second, on what I said earlier about currently we have both the SAT and GPA being taken into account in each and every student application. This is the first year where we're not going to have that with the UC system, or maybe next year. I'm sorry if I said something wrong there. But at that point, then GPA, the effect of GPA, how much it's taken into account is going to grow astronomically as soon as we take out standardized testing, right? And at that point, it's empirically been shown that white upper middle class students have higher GPAs for about the same level of education as shown by SAT tests that lower socioeconomic class students have. So at that point, you're increasing the bias in the college admission process as a whole. The SAT test itself is not biased. If you say the writers are biased, then their bias is negligible because first, the math section, there are word problems in the math section, but they're usually written in simple language, and there's no higher order academic language used. For example, it could be said that there's bias in, for example, a question on interest and bank accounts, because not everybody has a bank account. But that's something that you learn in school. That's literally an equation that you have to learn in school and learn about in school as part of the baseline education. This comes back to my point about the baseline public education being good enough to prepare every student for the SAT. And at that point, it's based upon how much effort you put into the SAT and how much you know, how much you remember, and how you can critically think over a 2.5-hour period. And at that point, then the SAT is the best way to gauge students' test prep skills, their ability to learn information over a short period of time, their knowledge over multiple years. And GPA simply doesn't do that because it's inherently biased, right?
Okay, so on your point about affirmative action, I'm pretty sure that doesn't even exist in the UC systems right now anymore. It got like removed. And then on baseline education, you say that GPA is good, but like, what's the point? Like, okay, so if GPA is like, okay, so you can say whatever you want about like richer people having a like inflated GPA, but if like there's so many studies telling us that GPA really doesn't like do anything, and it's actually the standardized tests that are biased, then what's the point of even?
No, your studies said that currently GPA has no adverse effect. In the status quo, GPA has no adverse effect.
Yeah, when you're only taking GPA.
But I'm telling, no, that's when you take into account. Okay, every admission right now, except in select colleges, takes into account both GPA and standardized testing. Once we take out standardized testing, then I'm telling you the value of GPA rises astronomically. That's my point.
Okay, so I'm going to say his study, and they found that there's virtually no difference in grades and graduation rates between submitters and non-submitters for the standardized test, because a 0.05% of a GPA point separated the students who submitted their scores to admission officers and those who didn't, and college graduation rates for non-submitters were just 0.6% lower than students who actually submitted.
I'm not talking about submission or graduation rate. I'm talking about admission rate, Jay, and that's not something cited by your study.
Yeah, so like what I'm saying is that there's really no point of having an SAT.
I'm only talking about admission rate. Your study says nothing about admission rate.
Oh yeah, so this is a different study. I'm saying that like when you examine data from 36 test optional US studies, people who submit their tests and their GPA and compared to people who submit their GPA.
Okay, these are from test optional universities, right? So these are not big schools. These aren't prestigious universities. These are pretty okay. So test optional schools right now. Can you give me a list of some schools that are test optional that are
Okay, I know
in
the
any way
UC
important
system.
to the American collegiate landscape?
I know the UC system is test optional. Actually, the UC system is removing standardized testing.
Yeah, they are. But
Um,
give me okay, from your study, any of the 3 dozen that are in any way large, important, prestigious
well,
universities.
okay, well, I'll have to check on my study, right?
While Jay
You can
chat,
take a while.
let's just formally move on to the next section, which is what you guys are already talking about. So why are so many colleges and universities making SATs and ACTs optional or not even accepting them, referred to as test blind at this point in time? Is this a step in the right direction or not? Jay, you can begin.
So basically, test optional or not accepting standardized tests as a whole is actually a great idea because you can bring up my Hampshire college, which eliminates standardized tests and like achieve remarkable results. Their class diversity
And
increased.
closed down.
Okay, but like that's correlation. Just let me finish. Their class diversity increased. The percentage of students who were first generation increased. The quality of applications increased, and the people who were accepted the invitation to join the college actually increased as well. So UC Berkeley and like multiple other studies tell us that GPA is just as like accurate as a standardized test. So there's really no point, and I see what colleges are doing. They're just taking it out because there's really no point to have a standardized test. If colleges are the ones accepting the standardized test and they are actually not accepting it now, that really says a lot about the standardized test itself.
Okay, so going test optional is first of all a bad idea because as I've said, it increases the value of GPA. Hampshire College is a bad example because one, it's a small school, two, it closed down, three, its sample size is tiny, and four, it's a liberal arts school. It's not representative of any prestigious schools that if we were to take out standardized testing, would be their applications process would be much different because greater value would be put in different areas which have more bias. And at that point, I said in any way, raising the value of GPA is bad, raising the value of essays is bad, and going test optional in itself is a bad idea because the SAT is the only objective measure of gauging students right now. So the SAT is completely objective, graded by computer. The essay section is graded by two people who don't see your name, don't know anything about you, don't see your bio. So it's the best essay, it's the most objective essay, and there's no bias within it, which is different if we were to go test optional because there's bias at every step of the college application then. Even if there's no difference in graduation rates between submitters and non-submitters, Jay doesn't mention admission rates, which is the only important stat in this debate. I mean, you can't graduate if you're not accepted in the first place.
Okay, wait. Can I just like speak on that? I said admission rates actually went up with no standardized testing.
Okay, at which school?
What?
At which school?
Hampshire and
Okay.
the UC.
Well,
System.
I mean, okay, first, the UC isn't test optional yet. And I don't know what you're talking about there. And Hampshire College, as I've already said, is a horrible representation.
Okay, yeah. So the UC one, they basically compared if they would admit someone, if they like took out, so people like applicants submitted their SAT and their GPA, right? And then the UC system was like, okay, so what if we just take out like their SAT score, just look at their GPA, and they found that there was virtually no difference in between in like who they will be accepting when you're just looking at GPA versus when you're looking at GPA and standardized testing.
Okay, well, that already tells you that there's bias in other places in the system, right? And the SAT is keeping that bias from continuing, right?
Wait,
We're
how?
saying that if you...
Because like I'm saying that there's no difference if you're looking at GPA versus standardized testing. Like,
okay, first, this wasn't an actual, like, this study is that UCs were never test optional. I'm going to need you to send that to me. And there comes a certain point when, as I've said, every other measure isn't objective of what a student knows.
So, okay, so when you say like there's a
Can you just
standardized
send me this study?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I just want to touch on this one point. So when you say there's like a standardized program in high school, then and like you say that the SAT is built off the standardized program, you basically tell me that there's a standardized program in high school and like they're all the
I didn't say there's a
projects.
standardized. I didn't say.
No, I mean there's like a standardized program curriculum for people to follow in high school.
No, there's not. I never said that.
Okay, our final section will be about like holistic application and about how standardized testing,
yeah,
GPA,
okay.
and other like parts of the application. But to finish off this section about like the direction colleges and universities are taking. So Jay, do you think the reason colleges and universities are going test optional or test blind, even in like the long term after coronavirus, is because they've recognized the like uselessness of SATs and ACTs. Adam, you can
Yeah. That's exactly why, because his study found that there is literally no difference between grades and graduation rates between submitters and non-submitters. And
Okay, and then at that point, what's the point of taking out the SAT if there's no difference?
no, but like
in
I'm saying,
anything?
what's the point of having an SAT if there's no difference? Because a 0.05%.
Because I'm telling you that objectively, it's the best way to have applications, and that your sample sizes are first. One from a school that isn't test optional, and from a school that closed down and has a tiny amount of students, like 100 students in the graduating
Okay, so
class.
what I say is that there's no like counter example to this. So I'd say that mine actually.
Okay, yeah, because colleges recognize that not having the SAT is a bad idea up till this point where we're in a coronavirus pandemic, which is the only reason the UCs have gone test blind for our class, right? Because students don't have the opportunities to take the test because it keeps getting canceled, and therefore there's bias in the test. Normally, there's no bias, right?
Normally, there actually is bias, like the cultural barriers, the language barriers, and socioeconomic status.
Okay, your language barriers thing doesn't make sense. If a student doesn't know English, then how are they going to learn at an English lecture in college?
No, I'm saying that if the
That's
math
literally what
section
you're
of the no, I see what you're saying, but if the math section of the SAT is asking a question with like very convoluted English and like
It's not in very convoluted English. Do you want me to send you the questions? It's very basic.
Okay, so
And at that point, then they're not going to do well on the reading section, and they're not going to go to college anyways. And at college, they have to learn in English.
okay, so basically what I'm saying is that imagine a math genius who doesn't speak English as their first language, but they're hoping to prove their intelligence to a college looking at
Take
their
the
test
TOEFL.
scores.
Just take the TOEFL.
Okay,
There's
but we're not debating about the TOEFL, right?
Yeah,
So
that's why this argument doesn't make sense. Students that don't know English don't take the SAT.
Yeah, so okay, exactly. That's my point. You're getting to it. So for a college that only accepts SAT and ACT.
No college does that. What?
What? I know several colleges that.
No, how do you think international students come to the U.S.? That makes no sense.
They take the SAT and the ACT, right? And they take the TOEFL as well.
Okay, no, they don't have to take the SAT and ACT. There's
there's
tests for international students in their home languages.
Yeah, okay.
There's no okay, this doesn't make sense as an argument. Sam, what's the next?
Wait. I really want to get at this point because if a college requires you to take the SAT or ACT and you do not,
classes are in English anyways.
No, okay. There can be classes in a different language, but I'm saying that the SAT and ACT.
Okay, I'm saying that all the main classes, if there's the math class, it's not going to be in. It's not going to be in some foreign language. It's going to be English.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that the SAT and ACT are intended to like test your knowledge, right? So if your knowledge isn't being accurately tested because of like on your math score because of your like lack of English, that's not an actual representation.
At that point, you're not taking the SAT. I've said this. There's other tests that can be taken.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that if you don't take the SAT, you won't get into a college because
that's just not true. Wait. How do you think international students who don't know English get into U.S. college?
That's the flaw in the system. Like that's literally
they do get into U.S. colleges.
Huh?
They do get into U.S. colleges.
Yeah, but there's a flaw because the SAT and the ACT require
don't matter when it comes to international students.
No, but okay, you can go on with that, but like so if international students aren't taking the SAT and the ACT, how can colleges compare students that are taking the SAT and ACT to the students
because they're taking different tests. Second, so then the international students are a minority, and at that point, you don't need an objective uniform test for them. You can look at each case specifically.
So then again, like, there's really no point of an SAT and ACT if it's not being
for international students. If it's like if it's a minority of students, if it's like if it's 2% of students, 3% of students in every class, if 97% are being graded on a uniform scale with no bias, no difference.
But it is biased. Like that's what I'm saying.
Well, that's the contested point. But if at that point, then you have to have the SAT for students in America.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move on to our final section in today's discussion, which will be about whether or not standardized tests fit into the holistic application, as colleges say. So how do measures such as standardized testing compare with other evaluations such as GPA, which both of you have talked a lot about, extracurriculars, essays, etc.? Adam, you can go first.
Yeah, so I think standardized tests should obviously be used in conjunction with everything else used in holistic application. I think the standardized test is a great measure of students' abilities to prepare for things, to be able to learn things in a short period of time, for students to remember what they've learned over a long period of time. It's a test of what students can retain and what students can, and how critically and how well students can critically think, and it's taken in a short sitting, right? It's not taking over multiple years. So it's obviously a great measure and it's completely objective. So you have to keep it, but you also need to use GPA as a part of the application process because it shows you how a student has done and they're in their specific classes and certain subjects that they are probably going to be taking classes on in college. And then extracurriculars relate even more to their specific major in college at some points, because then you can see their interest, what they've done, certain things that they've done. But you have to retain the SAT in order to keep it unbiased, because there comes a point where upper middle class students are doing better in GPA and they're doing better in extracurriculars, especially because of opportunities. For example, the elitism we see in certain competitions, like, for example, speech and debate, costing about $500 to go to one competition if it's in real life in person. That at that point, then there's obviously huge bias in all other parts of the application, even the essays, because they can be checked. And the only way to keep it unbiased is to keep the SAT there.
Okay, so basically to follow up with that, the SAT actually costs money, but then again, there's so many studies. You can take the UC system study, you can take HISA study, you can take Hampshire College. All three of them tell you that there's no difference between just taking a GPA or taking a standardized test and a GPA in conjunction in your application. There's no difference in there's a very minuscule difference in who is accepted between if you didn't accept your standardized test and your GPA, or you just did one or the other. There's literally virtually no difference. And what I tell you is that it's actually worse for low income students when they submit their standardized test.
Bringing up these studies. First, your own study says that right now there's a minimal adverse effect on low socioeconomic students because of their grades.
No, I said okay, so I said if low-income students only submit their GPA, that's when the lowest adverse effect is implemented.
Yeah, I'm telling you that if we take out the SAT completely, if we take out objective measures, then at that point, then those students are going to not get into college because of them not having the objective measure where they don't have GPA inflation. And as I've mentioned, extracurriculars are extremely biased. I mean, your only studies are one from a liberal arts school that's closed down, two from a school that never even went test optional in the first place. And what's your last study again? 3 dozen schools that nobody knows anything about.
It's 3 dozen test optional schools. Okay, yeah. But I feel like I want to hone in on this international students point, because
this point doesn't make sense in the first place. First, you have to know English in order to take classes at American college. The TOEFL exists.
Wait, I don't know. Yeah. Let's let Jay I want to hear what Jay has to say.
Okay, so basically, there's some colleges in the U.S. that only take the SAT and the ACT into consideration, and you have to, well, they do take it into consideration with conjunction of other things, but you have to submit an SAT and ACT score. The reason that there's a bias in this is because there's 1, cultural differences, 2, language barriers, and 3, socioeconomic status barriers. Even if you want to say that everything in the world has a socioeconomic status barrier, the purpose of a standardized test is to set it as standard, right? You want to eliminate this barrier, but by implementing the barrier in the test itself, that's implicit bias. Second, we go into language barriers. On language barriers, you see that students that take that want to apply to a college that requires you to take the SAT and ACT are actually discriminated against, because on the math section, if you don't know a problem with one word in English and then you screw up your math score because of that, that's not an accurate representation of your math skills. And then when you say that international students don't make a big population, I can give you the New School in New York, which has a 31% population of international students. The University of Rochester, which has a 27% population of international students. Florida Institute of Technology, 24% of international students. Boston University, 22%.
How did they get in?
22%.
How did they get in?
So what's happening is that there's a bias. There should be
how did they get in? How did those students get in if they had to take the SAT? They didn't have to take the SAT, or they knew English. First, all lectures at American colleges, unless they are a language lecture, are in English. At that point, then there's no reason to go to a college in America if you don't know the language, because you're not going to learn anything. Second, on the thing about the math test and that being biased, you have to take the math and the reading test at the same time. Okay, there's no splitting apart. And that at that point, you're going to get a low score anyways if you don't know English. That's why the TOEFL exists for students that don't know English, and that test is always taken into consideration for international students. This doesn't make sense in terms of linguistic barriers. On socioeconomic barriers, there's free test waivers, there's free test prep. Barely anybody can't prep the test. That's 6% of Americans who live in rural areas who don't have internet, and at that point, they're screwed anyways. They don't matter. On your third thing about What was your third thing? Racial bias?
Yeah, cultural differences.
Cultural differences. Okay, what is a cultural difference that is present? Just the writers being white and the test takers not being white? Is that all you're
Yeah,
talking
also
about?
the
Because
graders
that
of the
creates an
essay. The graders of the essay, yeah.
Okay, first, the graders of the essay. The graders of the essay are completely objective. They don't see the names. They don't know anything about the students. And yeah, they're great. They most likely are white, but they're grading an essay based on a rubric given to them by the college board. They're not just grading it on a whim. On the test writers, there's no reason for any of these questions to be in any way racially biased. The last time we saw a question like that was in like 1989, and we haven't seen a question that has been biased since. We've taken out the analogy section. There's the only bias that could maybe be seen is based on a socioeconomic level, and those questions are already taught in school specifically for that purpose. I've told you multiple times that all you need is a baseline school education from a public school, and you'll know everything you need to know in order to take the SAT or the ACT. There's no okay. In conclusion, GPA bad. SAT is the best way. GPA is bad on its own. The only way to have a non-biased application is to take the SAT in conjunction with everything else, because it's the only place where bias can be in any way fought. There's no points by the side that wants to take out the SAT that like affect anything other than the admission rates point. And maybe admission rates are the same for people of different socioeconomic classes, but his sample sizes, his studies themselves are 1, small colleges, 2, colleges that nobody's ever heard of, and 3, a school that never went test optional. There's no reason for us to take out the SAT because it's the only way to prevent bias from completely like taking over the college admission system.
Okay, so I'm going to direct a question towards Jay. But before that, I think it's an unfair statement to say that the 6% of rural Americans that don't have access to the internet to take the tests don't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to create as inclusive of a program to capture academic abilities as possible. So for Jay,
Okay, they're screwed anyways. They can't submit an application, right?
wait, you don't have to submit an application online.
Okay, then they can't. Okay,
And they should
aren't essays submitted online? Isn't GPA submitted online? Aren't all of these things submitted online?
So Adam makes the statement that GPA is bad because it can inflate across different schools. So do you think that colleges take into account this inflation? Is GPA a bad standard by itself?
Okay, I really wanted to get on this point because when colleges look at who they're applying, they look at you versus your school. So when you versus your school are all middle upper class people, you're all getting the same opportunity, then you versus your school is actually a great comparison. When you put standardized testing, it places you versus everyone in America, which is unfair. And then I just want to talk about luck. So there's yeah, what?
On your first point, just so we address that on your okay, so you're saying that that GPA isn't biased because you're compared to your school. First,
Well,
your school
also
go ahead. Your school is the initial weeding out process of which applicants from your school are in any way competitive for the school. But there comes a point where you have to be compared with students from other schools because there's simply too many applicants who are competitive from each school. And at that point, then GPA is more likely to be higher in a white upper middle class student than in any other student.
Okay, but then wouldn't okay, so now that we know that the SAT is also correlated with wealth, if you're comparing SAT scores from a lower socioeconomic status area and a higher socioeconomic status area, chances are that the GPA is going to be higher in the higher socioeconomic status area, and the SAT scores are also going to be higher in the higher socioeconomic status area.
I'm saying that the SAT is correlated with way too many things for us to focus on the socioeconomic class. I'm saying it's correlated with parental education, it's correlated with race, it's correlated with gender, it's correlated with multiple things, right? You can't just say that this one thing makes or breaks your SAT score because now, okay, so maybe in the past SAT may have been less accessible, but now we have internet for 94% of Americans and Khan Academy for every single one of those Americans. So over time, I think we're going to see a shortening of the divide over socioeconomic class. And I think that right now it's just a correlation and there's no causation. That's my point.
Okay. Last question for Adam. So I think both sides agree that GPA is a relatively good standard for comparing within your school. So can GPA be used in terms of percentiles, you are in the 95th percentile of your school in terms of GPA to compare with students from other schools?
I think that GPA can be used in some ways in the application, but taking out the SAT is a huge injustice to students from low-income areas and low-income families, because over time they're going to get the same prep as richer students.
Right. So basically what Sam's saying is there's something called like the Z-score, which measures your relationship to the average of your school in terms of standard deviations from the mean. So basically it's saying like how well do you compare to the average of your school. So it allows for your school to be compared to other people's schools if needed. That's what.
But I said okay, but yeah, it compares you to your school, right? So I said there comes a point where you can't be compared to your school anymore, and you have to be compared to students from other schools.
Yeah.
And at that point, GPA is inherently biased.
No, so okay, basically what I'm saying is that you could use the Z-score concept to apply comparisons between you and your school to people from other schools. Because
how many schools use this Z-score concept? Do all schools?
I'm not sure, but I'm saying that it exists for GPA evaluation, right?
Yeah, but it's not okay. But it's not used right now. Okay, but it's not used.
Well, do you like know it's not used? Because I don't know.
I mean, you have to present me some sort of evidence that tells me that it's used in any college.
But if you're like not telling me that it's not used, then I just say that like we can just take this into account.
Yeah, but
what I'm saying is that the concept exists, right? So if I'm in the 90th percentile of my school and I'm trying to compare it to someone in the 80th percentile of the 95th percentile of their school, it doesn't matter if I'm richer. It doesn't matter if I'm like more like if I have like a better background, because I'm compared to the percentile of my school. They're compared to the percentile of their school. Since they have a higher percentile, they're the ones that are going to be admitted from their GPA, because that's a better.
At that point, isn't there a bias against the higher socioeconomic class people because they're more likely to have more applicants from their school?
No, but okay, wait.
You're far likely to be more competitive, and at that point, Then at that point, aren't you being biased against the richer student?
So, so you're telling me that's literally how we create equality. Like that's the definition.
Okay, so you want college admissions to be biased against higher income people?
No, it's not biased against higher income people.
That's what you're saying right now.
We're putting people. Okay.
Hurting the people at the top versus helping the people at the bottom.
We need to ensure equality, because
at that point you're not helping the bottom, you're hurting the top, as Sam just said.
Isn't that good? Isn't that what you want? Because there are more people in the bottom.
No, hurting the top is not the answer. It doesn't solve for any sort of root cause, right?
No, I'm not saying hurt the top. Okay,
that's what you're saying.
Okay, I'm not saying that hurt the top. I'm saying that when you're in the same learning environment as the people in your school, you have the same you probably have the same income, probably have the same environment of learning, right?
But your school is far more academically competitive, so being compared to the average of your school at that point is
so that's why colleges. Okay, so this is why colleges don't take 5 people from every single school in the U.S. They take 10 people from this very good school. They take 6 people from this other school. They can choose how many.
Yeah, but you're being compared against. But you're being compared against way too many applicants from your school at that point. Because if you're from a richer school, you're far more likely to have a huge number of applicants. It doesn't factor. It doesn't equate. And at that point, and at that point, Z-score still hurts the people at the top and doesn't help the people at the bottom.
Okay, so
you're not solving for their bias. You're trying to stop the people at the top from succeeding.
Okay, so basically when colleges want to accept a student, they want to look at their intelligence. They want to look at their potential. If you're growing up in a very rich area and you are only in the 40th percentile of even a low socioeconomic status community, then obviously colleges are not going to want you. Colleges want people with potential. If I have the same intelligence, if I grew up in a very rich area and I'm very intelligent, I'm going to do very well. If I grow up in a very poor area and I don't have as much opportunities, I'm not going to do as well as the high socioeconomic status student because of
that's where the SAT factors in, though. That's where the SAT solves for.
Let me finish. Okay, and then I'm not going to be doing as well, but compared to people that I grew up in an environment with, I'm going to be doing very well, which shows that I have potential. No, it's not about direct knowledge. I say it's more about potential, because the purpose of a college and university is to foster these students and help them grow for the future. If they don't have the potential to begin with,
you have to be tested in some way in direct comparison, not through some sort of percentiles, to students who in a fair and objective manner against other students, right, from other schools, in order to be compared to them for an application. Yeah, at that point, the SAT is better than Z-score because the SAT is completely non-biased because it doesn't take into account grades. It doesn't take into account competitiveness of your school. It's just based on your baseline public school level education. It's better than
I'm saying that, Z-score, I don't even know if it's implemented right now. That was just a separate concept. I'm saying that the concept of a GPA is good because you can look at the
now you're saying
studies.
GPA good, but we've already agreed that GPA is extremely biased because it's inflated in higher level areas.
No, you can say that all you want.
Z-score was the way to make it fair. But if
no, it's
Z-score
not. GPA is already fair. I'm just saying Z-score as an
okay, so you're saying
alternative,
GPA is fair, but that's inherently not true because it's empirically been shown that you're far more likely to have a higher GPA if you're rich and white.
Okay, so you can say that, but the admission rates are no different between if you submit your standardized test score and a GPA versus if you submit just a GPA.
At what school?
Dozens of test optional schools.
Dozens of test optional schools. Name one.
Okay, let me bring it up. Just give me a sec.
I don't think current implementation matters that much because we aren't using Z-scores in the status quo. We are still using standardized testing. It's more about theoretically how effective it might be. So
yeah.
So Jay, after you pull up a school, let's end with closing statements.
Okay, so MIT.
So let's end with some closing statements. Have your views changed at all throughout the discussion? Adam, you can go first, then Jay.
Extracurriculars are extremely biased, and so are essays. The only way to prevent bias from completely permeating through the college admissions process is by keeping standardized tests. Because standardized tests test the student not based on how much they earn or how much their parents earn, but they test you based on how much you've learned over the last 10 years of schooling. At that point, standardized tests are extremely necessary because standardized tests are the only way to gauge an applicant that is actually non-biased. It's the only way to fairly test an applicant, and it's better than all of the alternatives. Therefore, we shouldn't take out standardized tests.
Jay?
Okay, so Adam tells us that there's that baseline. Okay, wait, let me start over. Okay, so the concept of the ACT and the SAT is to see how fit a student is for college. So when colleges want to accept students, they want to see what their potential is. They want to see how smart they are, what their potential is to grow in the future, to benefit as a person to society. When they're biased results, then there will be a biased amount of people accepted into these colleges, which is not a factor, which is not good, because there can be so many people that are just not accepted that have so much potential that can grow in the college. What's happening right now with standardized testing is we see language barrier biases. We see clear socioeconomic status biases with richer communities paying for these expensive prep courses, paying for these expensive tutoring systems where they can just benefit and boost their SAT and ACT score. And then we see low socioeconomic status people who are not able to afford this, who can't boost their score like that. So what happens is that in colleges misconstrue potential as SAT and ACT scores, and which basically means that they're going to be accepting a large amount of high socioeconomic status people and a small amount of low socioeconomic status people. And this is a clear bias. This is a whole poverty loop that we're actually implementing into our actual society. And when a college forces you to submit an SAT or ACT, they basically are biasing these results for you. And then there's also luck. So a person who scores 28 on the reading section could have answered just 2 more questions more accurately than a person who received a 26. These 2 questions could have totally been the rushed bubbling in of a random A, B, C, or D, but one student still gets a better score out of pure chance. GPA is a much better consideration because it's over a 4-year period. It's over a time where you can see a student's long-term potential rather than just them sitting down at a desk for 4 hours taking an SAT or an ACT. And that brings in a whole new realm of problems, because what if I'm not a good test taker? What if I have diabetes? What if I need insulin during my test and I go low on insulin and then I have to stop my test and then get extra test preparation time? No, that's just totally messed up. There's no real equity. There's no real equality. There's no way the only way to really look at a student's long-term success potential is to look at their high school GPA, to look at how well they did in high school, to look at their determination. So when people don't have internet, what the SAT does is that it basically just says oh, screw you, you don't have internet, you can't do any of this. But when people like when they like without the SAT, then colleges will be forced to like go like, oh, I should look at the schools the students like application, because since they don't have internet and they said it, I can look at their GPA instead, which shows a much better like factor of like how much potential they have. And it doesn't matter of like your actual score about your GPA. It matters about like the adversity you face, because when colleges look at you, they take a holistic approach to your acceptance. So what this means is that they look at like the factors of your upbringing. They look at your family, they look at your peers, they look at the competition at your school, and they determine your potential. It's not about clear knowledge. It should be more about potential. This potential is what we should, this potential like this threshold of potential is what the student should meet to be accepted into our college. It shouldn't be like, oh, this like the student has to get a 1600 on the SAT to be accepted into our college. That's totally not fair. We should be like basing our college acceptances off of potential. And this potential is what breaks the poverty barrier. This potential is what breaks the inequity in our world. And this potential grants more equality to lower socioeconomic status people. And thus, I'm so proud to be in a I'm so proud to like affirm a world where standardized testing isn't like solely considered.
Okay.
Oh, wait, that was like really, yeah, that was really long.
Oh, that's good. So thank you to both panelists for a productive discussion on standardized testing in the college application process. I hope both the viewers and the panelists have developed further nuance on the topic. Remember, no issue is black or white. You can benefit from standardized testing and still acknowledge possible inequities that might be perpetuated. Similarly, you can dislike standardized testing, but recognize its broad objective standard for all students. Thank you for watching. See you next time on Disagree to Agree.